All right, our keynote speaker. I have known Scott for so long. We were talking about this a little bit earlier. We've known each other for so long, we're not sure how long we know each other. You kind of get into that category after a while. Scott moved to California to work for Apple, and originally he was supporting the Lisa computer, which came out about a year before the Mac, for those of you that don't know. He provided support to Mac developers in the first years of the Mac, and he wrote books for Mac programmers. He worked as the first technical writer for General Magic, which has been called, quote, the most important dead company in Silicon Valley. It's also, as you know, the topic of choice in a great documentary about General Magic that came out recently on it. It's really a neat thing. If you haven't seen it, it's award-winning, and I encourage you to go and check it out. Scott regularly performs in his community theater. He has his own storytelling show about his 35-year history and career in Silicon Valley. With that, how about a very, very warm welcome for my friend, Scott Knaster.
How about my friend Neil Tickman?
Here we go.
Thanks, Neil.
There you go. All right.
It is 1984. Steve Jobs is on stage in Cupertino making history by announcing the first Macintosh computer. But he's also kind of making a little bit of another kind of history. He's sort of inventing the Apple keynote while he's doing this. It was really different. It was actually an Apple shareholders meeting, which is kind of a dumb way to announce a revolutionary new product, but that was how Apple could get all the press together in one place. So after they announced the number of proxies voted for each director and the shareholder initiatives, Steve Jobs came out and did his famous thing where he takes the Mac out of the bag. I'm sitting there watching this, knowing about the Mac, not realizing that it's the keynote that's being invented also. In fact, there's a photo of me in the audience sitting there. And I'm learning by watching this that the keynote is how Apple is going to introduce products to the world. I'm very prescient, I guess, in 1984, figuring that out. No, I didn't really know that, but it turned out that way. And it's very important. It's an important part of Apple's history. It's not just, here's a feature, here's a product, go buy it. There's a story. We used to call it feeds and speeds. It's got this, the CPU is this fast, there's this much memory, and so on. That's never been how Apple does it. Apple tells a story. They tell you how you'll use it. They show you. They use every emotion possible to get you interested in it, including humor, which is very powerful. Like when, at the iPhone introduction in 2007, Steve called a Starbucks and ordered 4,000 lattes. May I have 4,000 lattes, please, he said. And then he said, just kidding, and he hung up. But that was such a powerful event that, first of all, it was a really cool way to demonstrate Google Maps in 2007, which was pretty revolutionary. He said Starbucks, and all the pins dropped in for the 8,000 Starbucks in the vicinity of Moscone Center. And then by actually demonstrating it and making a phone call, rather than just stating what could be done, he made a very powerful impression. 12 years later, people still call that Starbucks. They've tracked it down, they call the Starbucks and order 4,000 lattes. And I'm sure they love that when it happens now. Last I heard, by the way, the woman who took the order is still working there. I don't know if that's still true, but bless her. Apple keynotes are masterpieces of storytelling, not just showing off technology, not just introducing products, but really telling stories. Storytelling? Doesn't this conference have tech in the title? Why am I up here talking about this? Well, I aim to convince you today that stories are important to us technologists and everyone else. and that you're already telling them, and you're already listening to them all day, every day. So we're going to talk about that. I'm going to talk about three things. Presentations, like the one I'm giving where I stand up here and talk to you. Conversations, where you sit in a room with your friends, family, coworkers, and exchange information. And stories, literal stories, where you tell someone something that happened a few years ago, or that reminds me of something that occurred to me last week. Presentations, conversations, stories. Presentations, conversations, stories. Are you getting it? Yeah. It's all the same. It's all the same thing. It's all about communication, and I've chosen for today's talk to call that storytelling. So when I say storytelling today, I'm referring to any kind of communication you have with, let's say, other people. Not computers, probably, yet, but with other human beings. Now, how did I come to this? I was a good, happy nerd, doing my happy nerd things, which didn't involve anything like storytelling. What the hell happened to me? That's what I'll talk about today. I'll also talk about why storytelling is important at Apple. I've given you a hint of that to begin with, and I think you can kind of see that, but I'll talk more about it, and you'll see why this has been happening to us via Apple for a long, long time, and we'll talk more about how effectively they use it and how we can use it as well. And hopefully, after I convince you that storytelling is important, I will try to offer some tips on how to be better about it. And hopefully you will pick up on at least one of them if you find it interesting. If you find it more interesting than the entire internet, which is sitting on the table in front of each and every one of you. We'll talk about that too, because that's something that people giving presentations have to deal with. What's so special about stories? Why did I think it was important enough to talk to in this keynote? Stories are, I claim, the fundamental way that people communicate. It's central to our culture. It's central to our religion. Before Keynote and PowerPoint and Google Slides, I have to say Google Slides because I work at Google, but really, before Keynote and PowerPoint, there were cave walls. And I guess people did presentations on cave walls. Let's just say that they communicated that way. They told stories that way. Storytelling is an essential human activity. We all do it. In fact, before Neil came up today, I was looking around the room, and people were talking, and bless all of you who were doing that instead of being on your devices. Well, there's nothing wrong with being on your devices. I do it all the time, too. But we were all communicating. And I would venture to say people were telling stories to each other. And I was out to dinner last night, and we were telling stories to each other. And we'll talk more about that today. So it's a fundamental human activity, a universal human activity. When you present to a group, when you tell someone how your weekend was, when you're talking to your family, when you're excited about something, or you're mad about something, or you're selling, or pitching, or arguing, or just trying to get someone on your side, or complaining about something you bought, trying to get your money back on the internet, you are all constantly telling stories. We are all constantly telling stories, and we're using a lot of our brain to do that. A lot of our big human brains help us in telling stories. By the way, I should mention that I mostly use light mode on the Mac. I've tried dark mode. I think it's for suckers, right, Adam? I've used dark mode. Sometimes it's okay. Today I'm presenting my favorite way, which is in dork mode. Okay. Where'd that come from? So a lot of times when I go on with people about this, they say, I don't need a whole story. We're computer people, we're engineering types, we work in IT, we're rational, logical. Engineering is this pure thing where something is on or off, it's right or wrong, it works or it doesn't. Storytelling is messy and human. It requires us to acknowledge our humanity and the humanity of others around us. But that's exactly why we need to tell stories, because of the humanity, because we're talking to humans. Humans require us to add the nuance and emotion that storytelling provides. When it's just computers talking to computers, I don't think they tell each other stories. They probably just exchange the bits. Although nowadays, who knows, because they're machine learning, right? So maybe they're inventing storytelling languages. But when we involve humans, which we generally do, that's when we need to put a story around it, or when it helps to put a story around it. That's why companies have product names. That's why companies have company names and brand names. This is not just a thing, it's got a name, and the name is designed to make you feel a certain way, to tell you a story. Colorful packaging, advertising, making a product sexy, which is a word I really hate when it refers to another thing rather than the main thing, but it means something. Excitement, so on, instead of pure engineering. That's all storytelling. Now there's this really awesome comic strip called Strange Planet that you've probably all seen by Nathan W. Pyle. I'll read it because it's maybe a little hard to read. This is where the planet was when you emerged. Tiny trash. They're throwing tiny trash at him. And now we sing, okay, I'll just stare at you. This is on fire, birthday cake. I will exhale on it. Extinguish, 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 extinguish. These folks really want to be human. They're not quite human. And so they have these human-like storytelling behaviors. And it's actually quite amusing, and you can spend a few hours reading these if you want to procrastinate from writing your presentation or something. Why stories? What's so special about them? Stories provide a framework for plain facts that you want to express. By putting a fact into a story, or by introducing a product, by telling a story around it, you give listeners something more to hold on to. Retaining your story becomes easier. It becomes sticky. Remember when we all wanted websites to be sticky? And then we decided that was too sticky? Well, now, or with storytelling, it's a way for people to remember. It's not just words. For example, a lot of people can memorize the lyrics to songs that they hear. If you gave them the same, words as prose, they might not be able to memorize it so easily. But putting the words into a song, giving it a melody, maybe giving it a story, makes it much more memorable. And a similar thing happens when you tell stories. Okay, now I said I would get to the part about what the hell happened to me. I was born a small nerd child. I don't want to say like maybe you were, but maybe you were. I was a typical indoor kid. I read comic books when it wasn't cool. Not only wasn't it cool, but you could get bullied for it. I watched TV when there were only 3 channels and no DVR or VCR or videotaping. I don't know how I survived. So, like, if you missed the one time they put King Kong on TV because you lost your TV privilege, I'm not saying this happened to anybody I know, but if that happened, you didn't get to see the original King Kong. And it was sad. But it didn't happen to me. I loved technology. I loved computers, even when a computer was a thing in a big room that I never got to see or touch. Computers were off somewhere in an air-conditioned room with a false floor. Anybody remember those? Sure. And when I got to college, maybe I'd be able to program one. Maybe they'd let me near one if I could get past the priesthood of people, I should say guys in charge, because it was always guys in charge. As an adult, I was still a normal nerd, like maybe you are. I don't want to judge. And I don't think of nerd as a bad word. And I became a big fan of Apple. I saw their ads. I saw their computers, and I thought they have something special going on. And after a few years, I knew I wanted to work there. And so, as Neil said, I figured out a way to move to California and work at Apple. But then I found that as a programmer, I was really slow and bad. And my problem was I wanted to stop and understand everything rather than just make it work. And that was fatal, even then. That was even before you had, packages where you put things together in libraries. And so I was a terrible programmer, but I became a good explainer. I wasn't that good at making things, but I really liked learning cool stuff and then telling somebody else about it. So I did a lot of teaching and training. I did support and demos. I used to say, on my resume, I used to say, I'm an explainer. Well, we have a word now that's mansplainer. And so I took explainer off my resume, and now I just say I'm a teacher. Or I help people learn, is the latest evolution. But really, that's what I love to do, is see and learn cool tech and then talk to other people about it. I'm not that good at making new things myself, and that'll figure in later as well. So I wrote books, like Neil said. Does anybody remember any of these books? Okay, a few people are admitting to their age and remembering these books from the early days of the Mac. One of my jobs at Apple was developer support, which means I helped developers write Mac apps, or as we call them then, software, or sometimes applications. There was a ton of documentation. We had this book called Inside Macintosh that was thorough and was updated pretty regularly, but there wasn't enough about the actual practical process of writing a Mac application. Like how is it debugged? So we used to have a class at Apple called Mac College that was in a really dumpy, rundown building that still stands in Cupertino. And we would invite developers to come in, and during the day, I'd stand and lecture about debugging processes in the Mac and different tools. And then at night, they would sit in cubicles in the other room and program and program and program all night. And people from different companies would share their work and help each other out. It was such a beautiful thing that would never happen today. Can you imagine? But I was telling people the same things every month at Mac College. We held it monthly. And I thought, why don't I write it down? Then I won't have to tell them, and it'll reach a bigger audience, and it'll be really useful. So Apple didn't want to publish this because it seemed a little outside the mainstream of the documentation. So I talked to outside publishers and wrote a book about it. And I started writing these books for outside publishers, and that's when I learned about writing books, which is a great way it's another way to not make any money. There are so many ways to make very little money. I had an editor who, if you bugged him and he wanted to put you down, he would calculate your hourly wage in writing your book. And it was always like 32 cents an hour or 19 cents an hour or something like that. So didn't want to bug that guy. As you can see, I worked at companies with cool logos. Most of my jobs were writing or support. I liked learning a cool thing and sharing it with people, as I said. When I got to General Magic, which Neil mentioned, I learned about this new thing, a tradition of storytelling within a company, where we would literally sit around, make time for telling stories to each other about fun and eventful things we had experienced, whether it was at the company or in our personal lives or years ago. And this was started at General Magic by Andy Hertzfeld and Darren Adler, who understood the power of this. I think Andy got it from Woz, who understood the power of this process. And it spread on to us. And we learned that this was a really cool way to develop culture within the company, as well as spread information. That was the first time it had occurred to me that telling stories like that was interesting. And then musical theater hit me. Like, what? How did musical theater get into this? So I admit to liking musical theater. I know that's a somewhat controversial opinion, but I enjoyed it. I would go to shows, and I would sit there in the audience, and I would find the easiest looking part and think to myself, I wonder if I could do that. That guy just came out on stage, he said 3 lines, and now he's done for the whole play because he's dead. Maybe I could do that. I didn't understand about ensembles, right? That like he came back and played 19 other parts later. I thought, yeah, I could do that. And in most plays, I could pick out the one person that I thought was on stage for 30 seconds and think, I could do that. I could probably do that. Then a horrible, horrible thing happened, which is my daughter got involved in a musical theater, a community theater company, which is no audition, where if you show up, you're in. It's not competitive. This is the thing that had been stopping me from actually following through on my complaining. She said, Dad, they have to take you. You have no excuse. And there's nothing worse than your child challenging you like that, especially saying you have no excuse for something. So I signed up, and I thought, I'm going to hate this, and I'm going to tolerate and endure these people for this show, and then I'll never have to do it again. Well, two funny things happened. One is I loved it, and the other is somebody made the mistake of telling me I was pretty good at it. So actually, even if they hadn't, I probably would have been hooked by the fact that I really loved it, unexpectedly loved it. And then I realized it wasn't a new thing. I had been doing theater all my career by getting up on a stage and doing a demo or teaching a class or giving a presentation. Those were all forms of theater. Maybe I didn't sing. Okay, I didn't sing. But it was theater, and I'd been doing it, and that was the common thread that I hadn't realized before. So here I was, 54 years old, playing a genie in Aladdin, crouched in a trapdoor under a stage with a smoke machine next to me about to go off, and I have to make sure I keep my head away from it so it doesn't burn my face off. And the smoke comes out, and I get up, and I thought, this is kind of absurd and kind of great. And it was so much fun and so unexpected, but it was a real turn in my life. Now, also about this time, as I thought about the stories in my life, I realized I've been fortunate to be around some real important turning points in tech history, being at Apple in the early 80s to late 80s, being at General Magic, which, as Neil said, there's a really good documentary out now you can watch, the most important dead company in Silicon Valley. Is that damning with faint praise or what? I've been around these things, but I haven't actually done them myself. I was there like writing documentation or watching them happen or helping them happen. And I thought, there's greatness going on here. It's not me doing the greatness, but it's going on. I'm sort of adjacent to the greatness. And I thought, hey, that's a good way to put it, adjacent to greatness. So I started to write up these stories that had seemed to happen to me in a blog that I called Adjacent to Greatness. I had a boss at Google named Louis Gray, who was a lapsed blogger, and he said we should sit down for an hour twice a week and write blog posts. And, you know, your boss says to do something, so you do it. So we sat down for an hour each week, twice a week, and wrote blog posts. And I wrote about these stories that had happened to me in my career, which is now 35 years long. And so we wrote these blogs, and I called mine Adjacent to Greatness. And then, as I got more involved in theater, I learned about this thing called a solo show, or solo storytelling show. I was slow, probably you all knew about this already, but this is a thing where one person gets up on a stage, usually for about an hour, and tells stories, usually autobiographical stories, and they can be funny or poignant. Hopefully they're interesting, and it's a thing, and it's a form of the art. And I thought, so instead of writing these as blog posts, maybe I could get up on a stage and tell them to whoever wants to show up and listen. But that I thought it would be fun and interesting because I'd get the performance fun as well as the writing the thing down. So that's when Adjacent to Greatness became a stage show. It took me a few years. At first, I invited friends to come watch, and I got up and told stories, and I was terrible. Like, at the end, I'd ask them what they thought, and they would say, I didn't understand what you were talking about at all. Because I tried to do fun things with time, like threading the stories in time. I don't know if I was trying to be Pulp Fiction or what, but I completely failed. Nobody knew what was going on. So I reorganized and re-edited and did it a few more times, and I finally got to perform at a venue for new artists at the Marsh in San Francisco, which is a very well-known venue for solo performance. And I got to polish it there and do a little bit of work there. And finally, a couple months ago in San Jose, that's where this picture's from, I got a theater and got up on stage for an hour and told 10 stories. And it's recorded, so it's on YouTube, so if you are having trouble sleeping and you want to watch this or part of it, it's on YouTube for free. And I should also add, I used a 10-second clip of music of the song Take On Me by a-ha. Maybe you know that song from the 80s. I won't sing it. I got dinged, not as a copyright hit, but the owners of that music for my 10-second clip took all the revenue that I might earn from advertising. So they actually YouTube gave me 3 options. Leave it there and they get all the vast revenue that might accrue from advertising. Replace it with a different song, I guess, and take my chances again, or remove it entirely. And I decided I'm going to leave it in. It's sort of it makes it a collaboration between me and a-ha. So me and a-ha posted this video, which you can get on YouTube. So now you know what happened to me, and now we can talk about the one company in technology that embraces storytelling more than any other. You probably already know which one it is. It's Apple, of course. Apple gives us the specs, the feeds and speeds. Apple tells us the story, and then we insert ourselves. We're invited to insert ourselves into that story, and we see how we will add these products to our lives. And that's the start of how Apple products become things that you can't imagine that you ever lived without. I should say we, because I'm part of that too. So how important is storytelling to Apple? This important. Apple spent $180 million to build a theater and named it after their founder. That's how important storytelling is to Apple. Apple launches are defined by careful, compelling storytelling. Products are launched with a story. Speakers, presentations, videos during the launches to tell the stories. After the launch, the web page tells the story. Sometimes it even continues from what was shown in the keynote. Sometimes the advertising tells the same story. Who remembers the original Apple Watch launch a few years ago? There was no compelling story. People did, and I think because Apple didn't know what it was. Apple wasn't really sure what the point of an Apple Watch was, so they kind of put it out there. And the initial reaction was sort of a dud. And then over time, by constant iteration, which is a strength of Apple, it became a device for fitness and health and notifications and whatever else it does, and a successful product that has evolved and that people know and use and understand. And Steve Jobs' theater, I think, is a physical manifestation of Apple's commitment. And speaking of venues, by the way, I heard a story that Neil thought it would be really cool this year to have the conference physically on Catalina Island in honor of Catalina. But they couldn't get the right permission. That's my only Catalina joke. Thank you. So I think this is why people say Apple is just marketing. Apple's just a marketing company. That's all they do. I think it's because they're really good at it. They're really good at telling a story. Of course, they're also good at engineering and design and lots of other things too, but the marketing works really well. Sometimes people just see the marketing, the stories. Apple's stories are so compelling that people want to hear from Apple. There are people who avoid spoilers before Apple announces a product, like you might do for a movie or a TV show, because they want to hear the the pure compelling story from Apple, and I get that. Of course, there are comedians and cynics who love to poke holes at Apple for doing this, promoting and presenting products this way. Conan O'Brien is pretty good at this. Jimmy Kimmel once in a while has a good one. But it seems to be working out pretty well for Apple. How many of you are familiar with the reality distortion field? How does that play in? Well, the RDF is how, for those of you who don't know it, this is a term used to describe the way Steve Jobs used his charisma and bravado and willpower to bend the universe and other people to his way of thinking. And the RDF fits really well inside the framework of storytelling. In fact, it's kind of made of storytelling because this is how Steve and Apple would project this information. The RDF lives on, I would say, even with Steve gone. The Steve Jobs Theater is not just the name of a building. It's the name of a philosophy. It's the way Apple introduces and promotes its products. And it's really what Apple's been doing the whole time for 40 years and continues to do today. And that's why the launches and the products remain compelling to this day. Let me give you an example of that. Let me introduce a new product for you. So, you know, we make new iPhones every year, and we made another one this year. It's 11, and it's pretty much the same as last year. Camera's better. There's some software for the camera that's interesting. It's a little heavier. Probably won't even notice. The battery's a little better. Oh, we have a Pro model too. That's one way to introduce iPhone 11, a really bad way. Here's how Apple introduced it. A transformative triple camera system that adds tons of capability without complexity. An unprecedented leap in battery life. And a mind-blowing chip that doubles down on machine learning and pushes the boundaries of what a smartphone can do. Welcome to the first iPhone powerful enough to be called Pro. That's how they did it. Except they did it with better slides. You might say, well, that's marketing. It's not real, it's marketing. But it is real when you say it, and people absorb it. It's just as real as the lame version I did before. It's also presented at a highly orchestrated event with lots of anticipation, the Apple Keynote, and it's reinforced afterwards with websites and ads and videos. Apple has a story for the iPhone 11 Pro and for all its products. That's how they roll. Now I'd like to move on to this section of our talk where I talk about how to be a great storyteller. But before I do, I have a question for you. How many of you are currently working with Macs in any capacity? You either have a personal one or you support them. Okay. Keep your hands up if you've been doing this for at least 5 years. Okay, at least 10 years. Nice. 15? 20? Okay, last one. Well, maybe I'll keep going. 25 years? 30 years. Awesome. Since the beginning, 1984. Anybody? Yes. That's so cool. How about before 1984? Okay. You know. What? Yeah, he's not here. So that's fantastic. You don't need a great story to be a great storyteller. It helps, makes it easier, but you don't need it. Even without one, you can make your story great. So find the great story that you have. Find a compelling storyline in what you need to talk about. And remember, when I say story, I mean all kinds of communication. Feature the interesting points in your story. Consider your audience when you tell a story. You need to find the path, the through line of your story. You can't do a good job of telling your story unless you know the story yourself very well, Make sure you know it really well before you try to tell it to anyone else. As you learn it, try to figure out what's interesting. Try to find the points that you think are interesting and focus on those. But when you're telling it, pay attention to the reaction, because the people you're speaking to will tell you what's important to them. And you ideally want to be able to tune yourself to what you get from them, whether it's interest or laughter or boredom or disinterest. You can tune what you're saying based on what you get from them. You must leave things out. You must not tell every detail, even things that really happened or seemed cool to you. If they're not absolutely pertinent to the line you're pursuing in the story, you have to leave them out. That's painful if you like to talk to people, but to make it more interesting, that's a compelling way to do it. Talk like you talk. Don't get into speaker mode. I'd like to thank you for... just talk like a person. Talk like you're talking to the people that you're talking to. Some speakers just kind of lapse into that, like a college lecture, or it becomes a speech meet. Just talk. Be yourself. They want to hear you. Here's one of my favorites. When you say you're thrilled, actually be thrilled. Well, this guy's supposed to animate. Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm not used to... Oh, that's so exciting. That was, wasn't he Steve Jobs in the movie? I don't know. Anyway, be thrilled, or even better yet, don't say you're thrilled, unless you're like jumping around thrilled. I don't want to break the stage. Be thrilled. I used to run the Google Developers blog, and I banned the phrase, I'm excited to announce. We're excited to announce. Banned. And I would search, don't do it now, but if you search the web for the phrase, we're excited to announce, you'll find way too many instances. It's overdone on top of everything else. Modesty and self-deprecation are really useful tools. Who remembers Apple saying, System 7 sucks less? They did. And this is powerful. It's good to be modest because it gives you credibility rather than saying how great you are all the time. It's much better to let someone else say you're good. There's a great quote from Jean-Louis Gasset. Advertising is saying you're good. PR is getting someone else to say you're good. Let the PR happen. Let someone else say you're good. And then quote them. Modesty and self-deprecation earn you trust and empathy. And they give you room to maneuver lately if you do want to say you're great. If you just say you're great, you're great, you're great, you're great, then people will not believe you. If you say, this is pretty good, and this is really great, and this is not so good, and we're working on that, that's an adult conversation. And I like that way of thinking. I understand, by the way, that goes counter to my primary example of Apple, who generally says they're great. But I prefer it. I prefer to hear from someone what the flaws are as well. Okay, get ready. I have some big news for you. When you speak, you are a performing artist. Congratulations. I'd like to congratulate everyone in the room for becoming a performing artist, because you are. As I said earlier, you're engaged in theater. You may not want it to be true, but it's true. You are performing. And I need to say, with great power comes great responsibility, as we all know. My advice, embrace it, work it, develop it. And take this motto to heart. It's not art unless it has the potential to be a disaster. Take a chance. Have fun with it. This is a Banksy poster, I believe. I ordered the t-shirt. It's on its way. Didn't get it in time to wear today. There are also different approaches for different stories, of course, and different audiences. You don't talk to your family the same way you do to your boss, probably, unless your family is your boss. Consider this. But there might be techniques that you can move from one venue to another, something you learned in a presentation at work that might be useful with your kids. Managing employees, managing kids. there's similarities, right? Those of you who've managed both probably have already used this trick. Different media. You can write, you can speak, you can make a video. You can be more or less serious depending on the venue. You can talk, yell, whisper. You can sing. You can tumble. You can do whatever is appropriate to the venue and whatever you can do. Start strong. Carefully consider your first. Your first word should not be, is this thing on? Your first word should be something powerful and memorable, and so should your last words. Choose words that are clear and precise and not ambiguous, and speak them with good diction so people know what you're saying. Consider using jargon. I can't say don't use jargon when you're speaking technically, but consider it. Consider your audience. Think about your tone. Be calm or be excited or questioning or confident, depending on the venue and the presentation that you're giving. Change your tone. You can speak more slowly or you can speak more rapidly, and you can change the inflection in your voice. Is it ever okay to bend the truth or lie in business? No. For entertainment? Yes. You can tell stories that might have things that are not strictly true to enhance a detail or make a character into a composite or an event or skip something entirely. Even then, I would advise you to avoid completely making stuff up, especially if you're representing it as truth, especially if you're talking to Ira Glass. So watch out for that. Steve Jobs stories have special rules. I'm a huge fan of Steve Jobs and his work. I didn't really know him personally. We interacted a few times, but I live in his world like we all do. When I decided to tell stories about my career, and I started listing them, the ones with him in them took over my show because they were the most interesting, because he's the most interesting character. And that's when I learned the 3 rules of Steve Jobs stories. Rule number 1, there is an insatiable demand for Steve Jobs stories. Everybody knows who he is, not just us technical folks. And they are fascinated by him. My normal, non-technical friends want to hear stories about him. Rule number 2, there is at least one more untold Steve Jobs story. They're still happening, despite his death more than 8 years ago. New stories about him come out from time to time. For example, recently Bob Iger, the outgoing CEO of Disney, published his autobiography. He wrote about his friendship with Steve, and new Steve stories emerged. I guess that's not surprising because 8 years is not that long ago, and people are still interested, as I said in rule number 1. And rule number 3, any story with Steve Jobs in it is a Steve Jobs story. And what I mean by that is there is no such thing as a story that goes, I went to a restaurant and there were some famous people there and Steve Jobs was there and then there was some other guy over there. If Steve Jobs is in the story, he must take over the story, or you must not mention him. So every story that with him in it is a Steve Jobs story, and they are very interesting. Finally, I have the tough love portion of my presentation. What happens when it all goes wrong, or when some of it goes wrong? Usually at least part of it goes wrong. What do you do? First of all, you are not in charge. You may be standing at the front talking and waving your arms around, but you're not in charge. Your stories mean what you think they mean. You wrote them down, you thought them up, they happened to you. They mean something. But after you tell them, they don't belong to you anymore. They belong to the audience. The audience interprets your stories. You can steer them, but you can't make them think of the meaning. They will always surprise you. It's like software. It's like you can test software a lot, and then you ship the software, and what happens? In the first hour, somebody finds a bug that you never dreamed of, that you never touched. Talks are like that. It's you against the internet. It's tough, and I'm sorry, but each of us is less interesting than the internet. So the whole internet is there. Okay, actually, you cannot win, but you can fight dirty. Here's something I'll try. Let's see. Okay. That was fighting dirty because it was meant to shame people who weren't paying attention. And I generally will not do that. I only did it because this, I used it in a meta fashion in this talk, right? I'm talking about it. But I've seen speakers try similar things. I wouldn't do that. Your audience is not there necessarily to cooperate with you. Most audiences are very interested and forgiving in what you want to do, but when it's you or the internet, or it's you or that text from home, or you or their email, sometimes they're interested in the other thing, and that's fine. The audience is lovely people, and when they have the internet in front of them, which is the greatest and most compelling piece of entertainment ever invented, you're going to lose some of them some of the time. That's okay. So what can you do? Not much. Do your best. Focus on the people who are listening to. Look at them if you can, even if you're just talking to one person, whether it's a presentation or at the dinner table. Keep going. Even if it's 0 people, keep going, because one might opt back in. Although it's hard, but I would advise that. All right, what did we talk about? As I recap what we talked about, I want to tell you about another rule that I use, which is when you start a presentation, say what you're going to say. Give an overview. Then give the talk, and then at the end, say what you said. So you're soaking in this right now. We talked about the importance of telling and listening to stories, and I claim that we're all doing it all the time, all day, and have done all our lives. I told you about how I ended up appreciating storytelling. And really, I discovered I'd been doing it all my life, and so have you. We talked a lot about how Apple uses storytelling to make a strong connection to its customers and developers. And then we spent some time talking about ideas of how you can improve your own experiences with stories and storytelling. What do you do next? Well, I put together some links because I know you'll all be interested in going off and researching this topic. And I put these on my blog at adjacenttogreatness.com. You can see them there, and you can go and look at the links at that website. And practice. If you're interested in this, in any form of this, see if you can find an audience. Present at conferences. Find an open mic. Corner your family. In closing, I want to say that you should go and tell your stories to the world intentionally. You've been doing it anyway. Do it intentionally. I bet this guy would like you to. And I think this guy would like you to. This guy would not like you to. This guy would definitely like you to. Thank you.